It was the sort of summer day that seemed plucked from the pages of a country calendar. Sun-drenched lawns, murmuring bees, the chime of distant church bells. The village of Netherhedges basked in warmth and contentment, and the annual garden, fete at the vicarage, was in full swing. Children darted between booths with sticky fingers and shrieking laughter. Older ladies manned stalls festooned with preserves and jam jars, and the air was heavy with the scent of roses and sponge cake. Miss Jane Marple, seated under a lilac-striped parasol beside the tea tent, stirred her cup with delicate precision. Her faded blue eyes, sharp as glass, took in every detail of the event. The mischief of the Bennett twins as they swapped a winning coconut shy ball for a dud. The way Mrs. Holloway's gaze lingered on the young curate longer than seemed entirely decent, and the curious stiffness with which Mrs. Audra Lytton Smythe accepted compliments on the floral arrangements she most certainly had not assembled herself. "Such a splendid turnout this year," said Mrs. Banbury Scott, plump and pink-cheeked, lowering herself into the folding chair beside Miss Marple with a grunt. "And can you believe Audra Lytton Smythe is actually smiling? Must be the influence of that ring she's always flashing about. Dreadful thing, really. Far too grand for village wear." Miss Marple glanced toward the center of the lawn, where Mrs. Lytton Smythe, dressed in lavender silk and imperiously surveying her domain, stood with one gloved hand raised just so, enough to catch the glint of her famed sapphire ring. An ostentatious piece, too large to be elegant, it had been the subject of much whispering since her return from a restorative trip to Ceylon the previous winter. "It is rather large," Miss Marple said mildly. "Some might say cursed in the right light." "Oh, you heard that too?" Mrs. Banbury Scott leaned in with relish. "Rumor is her husband's death wasn't entirely natural. Fell from a balcony, poor man. Local authorities called it an accident, but there was talk." Miss Marple took a sip of tea and said nothing, which was often how she said the most. Just then, the vicar's wife struck a triangle to signal the start of the charity raffle draw. Excitement rippled across the green as tickets were fished from handbags and jacket pockets. A small wooden table had been set up with a cloth-covered box and a gilt-edged envelope containing the winning numbers. Mrs. Lytton Smythe, of course, had been asked to draw the winning ticket. She glided forward with theatrical grace, sapphire ring flashing in the sun. The crowd hushed. A small girl sneezed. The vicar's dog barked once, uncertainly. With a rustle of silk and smugness, Audra reached into the box and pulled free a yellow ticket. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Her eyes had fixed, strangely, on the contents of the envelope in her other hand. Then she swayed. Someone gasped. The ring fell first, spinning, once before vanishing into the grass. Then Audra Lytton Smythe crumpled to the lawn in an elegant heap. For a moment, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. Women screamed. The vicar dropped his teacup. The doctor, Dr. Hubert Eccles, already halfway through a scone, hurried forward with a muttered, "Make room, please. Let her breathe." Miss Marple rose slowly and approached the body, quiet amid the bustle. Her gaze was not on the sapphire ring, which a child had just discovered and was holding aloft with delight. Nor was it on the figure of Mrs. Lytton Smythe, who lay pale and utterly still, her silken scarf slightly askew. Miss Marple was watching the crowd, the way they moved, the expressions that flickered too quickly to be hidden, the tremor in the hand of the man who fetched water, and the way Mrs. Holloway turned her face not toward the body, but away from it. "Dead?" someone asked breathlessly. Dr. Eccles, straightening, gave a grim nod. "Yes, I'm afraid so." "But how?" the vicar's wife whispered. "She just dropped." Miss Marple bent and retrieved the sapphire ring from the child's palm. "It seems," she murmured, more to herself than anyone, "that the fete has taken an unfortunate turn." From across the lawn, Constable Rudge came hurrying in, having been summoned by the bell rung with frantic insistence by a local boy on a bicycle. His notebook was already out, though it would soon become apparent he had no idea what to do with it. "She collapsed during the raffle, sir," someone told him. "Just fell right over." "Heart attack?" Rudge asked, looking hopefully at Dr. Eccles. Eccles hesitated. "Possibly, though she was in good health as far as I know, but best we not speculate until the coroner arrives." Miss Marple, standing a little to one side now, remained silent. Her hand closed softly around the ring. Something about it, about the moment it had fallen, troubled her. Not the ring itself, but the way Mrs. Lytton Smythe had clutched at it before she collapsed. Not protectively, but almost fearfully. A small incident, to most. But Miss Marple knew that death rarely arrived without leaving footprints behind, and there had been something distinctly deliberate in the moment before Mrs. Lytton Smythe fell, like a player reaching the end of a scene. As the crowd dispersed and murmurs took hold of the village, Miss Marple quietly tucked the ring into her reticule, glanced once more at the figures gathered in tense clusters, and thought, "Someone here knows exactly why Audra Lytton Smythe died, and it wasn't chance, and it wasn't fate." The shock of Audra Lytton Smythe's sudden death spread through the village of Nether Hedges like ripples across a still pond. By the time the fete had been shut down, the bunting pulled down early, and the remaining sponge cakes wrapped hastily in napkins, every household within a half-mile radius had already heard the news and offered their own version of events. "She was cursed, I tell you," declared Mrs. Finch, the greengrocer's wife, as she rearranged pears in her shop window the next morning. "You don't wear a stone that size without consequences. Blue like ice and probably just as heartless." Down at the post office, Mr. Jennings, the retired solicitor with a fondness for pipe tobacco and unnecessary legal speculation, insisted the ring was likely stolen. Inherited through dodgy colonial channels, no doubt. Can't wear spoils like that without someone wanting them back. At the Rose and Crown, the village's only pub, theories were served as freely as the lunchtime ale. Poison, jealousy, unfaithful lovers, all were floated, some more plausibly than others. But in the quiet drawing room of her ivy-covered cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat in her high-backed armchair, the afternoon light gently pooling across her lap. She was not one to speak quickly, especially not when others were already shouting. The sapphire ring now sat in a small velvet-lined box beside her, nestled between a dried violet from last spring and a tarnished thimble she used as a paperweight. It looked less grand here, removed from Mrs. Lytton Smythe's commanding presence. Less cursed and more peculiar. She'd examined it closely. No hidden compartments, no powdery residue. Just an unusually large stone, deep blue, with a fine but visible scratch across the band. A recent one, perhaps. Her fingers had brushed it without hesitation, and yet she had felt no chill of superstition. No, Miss Marple didn't believe in curses, but she did believe in secrets. It was nearing 5 o'clock when the expected knock came at her door. She rose and opened it to find Constable Rudge shifting from foot to foot, his expression somewhere between embarrassment and desperation. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat. "Beg pardon for disturbing you. The inspector thought you might— Well, you were there. You might have seen something useful." Miss Marple smiled gently, stepping aside to let him in. "I imagine you've had quite the day, Constable," he coughed. "That's putting it mildly." She led him to the small table near the window, where tea had already been laid for two. "Do sit. I've just brewed it." He hesitated only a moment before sinking into the seat with a grateful sigh. Miss Marple poured for him, her manner as calm as if discussing rose varieties. "The death," she said, "was very sudden. Too sudden, perhaps, for someone in good health. Was there any sign, beforehand I mean, that Mrs. Lytton Smythe was unwell?" Rudge shook his head. "Not that we know of. Dr. Eccles says her heart was strong. No signs of stroke or attack. Not visibly. The coroner's coming in from East Monfield should be here tomorrow. Till then, we're treating it as suspicious. Quite right. He paused, watching her. Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but people are already talking about that ring, the sapphire. They would, she said mildly. It was rather hard to miss. She was clutching it, Rudge added. Right before she fell. Miss Marple inclined her head but didn't speak. Inspector Cray thinks maybe she swallowed something, poisoned her tea or her scone or something like that. And yet, Miss Marple said, she was the only one to collapse, and many others had tea and scones. I saw at least 4 people served from the same tray, and she didn't eat anything just before she read the raffle number. Rudge blinked. You're quite sure? I was watching. He rubbed the back of his neck. Then what do you think it was? Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. Tell me, Constable, has anyone come forward about the raffle prize? The one she never announced? Rudge frowned. Funny you mention it. The envelope was missing when we looked for it. Can't find it anywhere. Curious, she murmured. And the ticket she drew? Gone as well. She sipped her tea, then reached for a slice of shortbread. It would appear that someone did not want the raffle result to be known. A small detail, perhaps, but one wonders why. You think it's connected? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that when someone dies in the middle of a public event, in full health and in full view, one ought to ask not only how, but why that moment. Why then? Why not earlier? Or later? Rudge stared at her, then down at his tea. You think she was meant to die in front of us all? Miss Marple didn't answer. She simply looked out the window, where a sparrow was hopping along the garden wall. I should like to speak to a few people, she said at last. Just casual conversation, nothing official. Would that be acceptable? Rudge brightened. We'd be grateful. Inspector Cray might pretend otherwise, but we both know you've got more sense than half the county combined. She smiled, her eyes twinkling. You're very kind, Constable. Perhaps I shall begin with the curate. He seemed rather shaken. Reverend Colin? Rudge nodded. Yes, and he'd only just come back from Cambridge last week. Took up his post 2 months ago. Nice lad. Nervous type, though. He's lodging at the Partridge House with Mrs. Holloway. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Holloway. Yes, she looked most distressed yesterday. She was the one who fetched the doctor, Rudge said. Very efficient. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. But she never looked directly at the body. Not once. That evening, as nether hedges settled into a nervous hush and curtains twitched just a little more often than usual, Miss Marple donned her shawl and hat and set out for a walk. The path led her past tidy hedgerows and pink-blossomed dogwoods toward Partridge House, a prim Georgian structure with clean white shutters and an air of over-maintained order. Mrs. Holloway answered the door with evident surprise, though not displeasure. Miss Marple, I thought perhaps it was Colin come back from evening prayers. Do come in. The drawing room smelled faintly of lavender polish and tea biscuits. On the sideboard, a glass decanter stood half full, the scent of sherry lingering in the air. Miss Marple settled into the chair offered and waited as Mrs. Holloway poured tea. You were very brave yesterday, she said kindly. So quick to help. Mrs. Holloway flushed slightly. I only did what anyone would have. Even so, it's a terrible shock. You knew Mrs. Lytton Smythe well, I assume? Well enough. She could be rather formidable. Indeed. I remember hearing. She returned from Ceylon under a bit of strain. Mrs. Holloway's hands faltered for the briefest moment. So I'd heard. Not illness, perhaps, but trouble of some kind. Mrs. Holloway busied herself with sugar tongs. There were rumors. But then, there always are. And Audra never confided in anyone. Not really. She wore the ring. Constantly, I noticed. She was proud of it, said it brought her luck. Miss Marple sipped her tea and said nothing more. But in her mind, pieces were already forming outlines. A hidden envelope, a public collapse, and a cursed ring. No, luck had nothing to do with it. Outside, the evening sun dipped lower over the hedgerows. And inside, Miss Marple sat quite still, her gaze fixed gently on Mrs. Holloway's hands, which trembled, just once, before stilling again. The performance, she thought, had already begun. The following morning, Nether Hedges woke to a brittle chill that hinted at the end of summer. The village, though outwardly unchanged, carried the invisible weight of Audra Lytton Smythe's death like a shadow stretching between its neatly trimmed hedgerows and cobbled lanes. Conversations began anew as windows were opened, letters posted, and footsteps echoed on familiar paths. Yet, beneath the polite veneer of routine, unease simmered. Miss Marple, having passed a restless night turning over the events in her mind, made her way toward the vicarage. The village's spiritual center was also the heart of the unfolding drama, where the garden fete had collapsed into tragedy, and where the threads of suspicion were already tangled. The vicar, Reverend Edward Crane, greeted her with a weary smile that did little to disguise the concern in his eyes. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I trust you slept well enough?" "As well as one can, given recent events," she replied kindly. "How are you holding up?" He sighed and gestured to the garden, now carefully cordoned off with a pale blue police tape that fluttered softly in the breeze. "This place feels different. Hollow. Like the laughter itself has fled." She nodded, glancing toward the spot where Mrs. Lytton Smythe had fallen, now marked only by a solitary rose bush, its blooms heavy and fragrant. "Inspector Cray arrived early this morning," the vicar continued. "He is thorough but rather brusque. I'm afraid his presence only heightens the tension." Miss Marple smiled gently. Sometimes brusqueness is a necessary mask for uncertainty. Perhaps. The vicar looked off toward the village green where groups of villagers gathered, their faces drawn tight in speculation. "We must be cautious," Miss Marple said softly. "There are many eager to fill the silence with their own theories, but the truth often requires a quieter approach." "Do you have a theory yourself?" Reverend Crane asked, curiosity flickering in his gaze. "I have questions," she said, "and a suspicion that the answer lies not in what was lost that day, but in what was hidden." As they spoke, a figure approached along the gravel path. The young curate, Reverend Colin Marsh. His pale face bore the unmistakable marks of a sleepless night, eyes shadowed but determined. "Miss Marple," he greeted her quietly. "I heard you were here. I wanted to speak with you, if I may." "Of course, Reverend. Please join us." Once Colin was seated, his nervous hands fidgeting with the collar of his clerical shirt, Miss Marple observed him thoughtfully. "How are you finding Nether Hedges so far?" "It is a peaceful village." "Certainly," he admitted, "though this tragedy has cast a pall that no sermon could easily lift." "Were you close to Mrs. Lytton Smythe?" Colin's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not close, no. But she was a frequent attendee at church events and the garden fetes. Polite, if somewhat distant. I did notice she was anxious of late, but I thought it might be the strain of managing her estate." "Anxiety, you say?" "Yes. Just before the fete she seemed distracted, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if expecting something, or someone." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the handle of her teacup. "Did she confide in anyone? Perhaps a friend or family member?" Colin shook his head. "No one that I know. She kept her troubles private. Secrets, Reverend, often have a way of speaking louder than words." As the curate spoke, Miss Marple's mind drifted briefly back to Mrs. Holloway's hesitant demeanor the evening before, the faint tremor, the evasive answers. The village was a delicate web of relationships, and each strand vibrated with its own tension. When the conversation turned to the sapphire ring, Colin's face paled. "I heard the rumors about it," he admitted, "and about the curse. Do you believe in curses, Reverend? He smiled wryly. No, but superstition has a hold on many here, especially when fear takes root. Miss Marple inclined her head. Indeed, fear can make the most reasonable people see ghosts in the garden. Their discussion was interrupted by a sudden commotion. Outside. Through the window, they saw Constable Rudge ushering a woman hurriedly across the garden. Her face was flushed, and her eyes wide with distress. That's Mrs. Bennet, the vicar said. She owns the village shop and is known for her forthright nature. I wonder what has unsettled her so. Miss Marple rose and followed the vicar and Colin out into the garden. Mrs. Bennet, breathless, greeted them with urgency. It's Mr. Lytton Smythe, she panted. Audra's late husband's brother, Percival. He's arrived unexpectedly this morning. Miss Marple's brow lifted. Has he spoken to the police? Not yet. He's been asking around, though. Looking for the ring, they say. Looking for the ring, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Curious. Reverend Crane motioned toward the village hall, where Mr. Percival Lytton Smythe was now waiting. The man was tall and imposing, with a sharp jaw and eyes that seemed to miss. Nothing. Miss Marple approached him with calm dignity. Mr. Lytton Smythe, I'm Jane Marple. I understand your arrival has stirred some questions. Percival's gaze was direct. Miss Marple, I only wish to pay respects to my sister-in-law, and to recover a family heirloom, the sapphire ring she wore. Is the ring of great importance to your family? Yes, it has been passed down through generations. There are stories attached to it. Stories can be as dangerous as curses, Miss Marple said gently, and sometimes more revealing. Percival glanced around, lowering his voice. My brother's death was no accident, and Audra was not as innocent as she appeared. There are old wounds in this family, wounds that someone may have wanted to keep hidden. Miss Marple noted the sharpness in his tone. I expect many here have secrets they prefer remain buried. That's putting it mildly, Percival said, grimly. And now with Audra's death, those secrets are threatening to surface. As the morning waned into afternoon, Miss Marple found herself surrounded by whispers and half-truths. She visited Mrs. Holloway again, spoke with the vicar's wife, and even exchanged a brief word with Dr. Eccles, who maintained his professional composure but seemed inwardly unsettled. At the heart of the village, the disappearance of the raffle ticket and the missing envelope remained puzzles that no one had satisfactorily explained. Miss Marple's attention was drawn, too, to the scratch on the ring's band, a detail that, in her experience, often held a key. Later, as twilight softened the edges of the day, Miss Marple sat once more in her cottage. She opened her reticule and removed the sapphire ring, turning it over in her hands. The stone caught the fading light and seemed almost to pulse. She spoke softly, more to herself than anyone else. No curse, then, but certainly a motive, and perhaps a threat. Her thoughts circled back to the moment Mrs. Lytton Smythe had clutched the ring before collapsing, not in fear of a ghost or superstition, but in dread of a living, breathing secret finally catching up. Somewhere in Nether Hedges, a murderer walked freely, and Miss Marple, with all her gentle scrutiny, was determined to uncover the truth beneath the village's polite facades. The night deepened, and with it, the mystery thickened, wrapped tightly around a sapphire that gleamed with untold stories. The morning air in Nether Hedges was crisp, touched with the scent of damp earth and early autumn leaves. The village moved slowly into its new rhythm, the hum of gossip replacing the silence left by Mrs. Lytton Smythe's absence. Behind closed doors and beneath prim facades, shadows lengthened, not just from the lowering sun, but from secrets that refused to stay buried. Miss Marple had spent the better part of the morning revisiting familiar places, guided less by official inquiry than by her own quiet instincts. She found herself back at the Rose and Crown, where the villagers gathered as much to exchange news as to drown worries in bitter ale and stout. The inn's low-ceilinged interior was dim, warmed by the glow of a single fireplace and the murmur of hushed conversations. At a corner table sat Mr. Edward Hensley, the local solicitor, a man whose lean frame and precise manner made him seem more clerk than confidant. His sharp eyes flicked toward Miss Marple as she approached. "Miss Marple," he greeted, nodding with a faint smile. "I was hoping to find you here. There is much stirring, and not all of it of a civil nature." She took the chair opposite. "Him? I imagine that's true. Have you heard anything worth noting?" Mr. Hensley folded his hands. "Well, as you know, Audra Lytton Smythe was a woman with considerable influence, and, some say, considerable enemies. Enmity, like a garden weed," Miss Marple murmured, "often grows quietly until it chokes the roses." He chuckled softly. "Indeed. There's talk that her return from Ceylon was clouded by more than just ill health. Some whisper about disputes over the estate, especially involving her late husband's family. The Lytton Smythes have been in nether hedges for generations, haven't they? Long enough to accumulate debts and resentments in equal measure." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the fire. "And what of Mr. Percival Lytton Smythe? Has he said anything beyond his concern for the ring?" Mr. Hensley's face tightened. "He's been asking questions, sharp ones, about the raffle ticket, the missing envelope, the circumstances of Audra's death. But I fear his timing is problematic." "In what way?" Hensley hesitated, then lowered his voice. He arrived unannounced, at a time when the village was still reeling. Not everyone welcomes his presence. The conversation was interrupted as the door swung open, admitting a gust of cool wind and the figure of Inspector Cray. His tall frame and brisk manner always commanded attention. "Miss Marple," he said curtly, nodding at Hensley before turning to her, "I hear you've been asking questions." "I've been listening," she corrected gently. "There is a difference." Cray's eyes narrowed. "We can't afford distractions, Miss Marple. The village is anxious. The sooner we close this case, the better." "And yet," Miss Marple replied with quiet firmness, "the sooner we rush, the greater the risk of missing the truth." He regarded her for a moment before turning away. "I'll be at the police station if you need me." Once the door had closed, Miss Marple leaned back and let out a soft breath. "Village politics," she murmured. "A web not unlike those spun by spiders, delicate and deadly." She left the pub shortly after, her mind turning over the pieces she'd gathered. The missing raffle ticket gnawed at her, as did the unexplained scratch on the ring's band. Something had been taken, or hidden, to obscure the truth. Her next visit was to the village shop, where Mrs. Bennet stood behind the counter, arranging jars of marmalade with deliberate care. The shop was bright and orderly, but the woman's face betrayed a recent strain. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Bennet," Miss Marple began. "How are you managing?" "Oh, you know, one day at a time," the shopkeeper replied with a weary smile. "The village is a bit unsettled, what with all that's happened." "Have you noticed anything unusual in the days leading up to the fete?" Mrs. Bennet paused, considering. "There was a new face around, a Mr. James Cartwright. Said he was interested in buying the old Miller place on the edge of the village. He asked about Mrs. Lytton Smythe, too." "James Cartwright?" "Businessman, or so he claims. From London, I think. I didn't see much of him, but he certainly made an impression." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did you see him at the fete?" "No, I don't think so." "That's interesting." Before Mrs. Bennet could reply, the bell above the door jingled, and a young woman entered briskly. She looked around, spotted Miss Marple, and approached with a hesitant smile. "Miss Marple," she said, "I hope I'm not intruding. I'm Clara Wren from the post office. I thought you might like to hear something I overheard." "Do sit, Clara. Please tell me." Clara's eyes darted nervously. "It's about the raffle ticket, number 23. I heard Mr. Cartwright talking to someone near the village green just before the event started. He seemed very interested in the outcome. Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. "And did you catch what was said?" "Only bits. Something about making sure the right number wins. It sounded odd." "Indeed." Clara's fingers twisted in her lap. "I didn't say anything before. I wasn't sure if it was important." "Sometimes the smallest details hold the biggest keys," Miss Marple said softly. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple decided to visit the Miller place herself. The old farmhouse was a ramshackle affair, its windows boarded and garden overgrown, a stark contrast to the manicured lawns of the village center. The gate creaked as she pushed it open, and footsteps approached. A man stepped out from the shadows, tall, with a sharp-featured face and a cautious smile. "Miss Marple, I presume," he said, extending a hand. "James Cartwright. I suppose. You've heard a lot about me." "I have," she said, shaking his hand. "And I thought a visit was long overdue." He glanced around the property. "I'm hoping to restore the place, give it new life." "And your interest in the Lytton Smythe ring?" Cartwright's smile faded. "I won't deny it's a valuable piece, but my involvement is purely business. I want to buy the estate, nothing more." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "People rarely come to quiet villages without purpose, beyond what they admit." He laughed softly. "I suppose that makes me no different from anyone else here." She pointed to the stone path leading to the back of the house. "May I ask if you were at the garden fete?" "Yes. I arrived just before the draw. But I didn't stay long. There was an atmosphere I didn't like." "And the missing raffle ticket? The envelope?" Cartwright looked genuinely surprised. "I had nothing to do with that." "Of course," she said. "I'm merely gathering facts." As she turned to leave, he called after her. "If you need anything, Miss Marple, do let me know." Outside, Miss Marple paused, the fading light playing off the blue of the sapphire ring she had tucked carefully in her bag. The threads of the mystery wove tighter: the sudden arrival of a stranger, the missing ticket, the silent tension among the villagers. And yet, the true picture remained just out of reach, like a shadow behind a curtain. Returning home, Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair, eyes distant but sharp. The village held its breath, waiting for secrets to surface. But in the quiet, Miss Marple knew one thing with certainty. The sapphire was not just a jewel, it was a key. And it would unlock the truth, one way or another. The days that followed passed in a blur of subdued tension and quiet whispers, as Nether Hedges struggled to reclaim its peaceful facade. The village, once a tableau of gentle routines and predictable rhythms, now felt like a delicate stage upon which every smile and glance carried the weight of hidden meaning. Miss Marple observed all with her usual calm, her keen mind piecing together fragments as though assembling a subtle tapestry. One morning, as mist still clung low over the fields, she made her way to the vicarage, an imposing stone building draped in ivy. Reverend Samuel Ambrose had long been a fixture of Nether Hedges, known for his compassionate nature and a discreet ear for village confidences. Miss Marple hoped his perspective might shed light on the undercurrents she suspected. The Reverend welcomed her warmly into his study, where shelves groaned beneath volumes of theology and local history. He poured tea with practiced ease and settled into an armchair opposite her. "I'm grateful for your time, Reverend," Miss Marple began. "I understand you were close to Mrs. Lytton Smythe?" "Indeed," he replied, a hint of sadness in his voice. Audra was a complicated woman, but she had a genuine heart beneath her formidable exterior. The village owes her a debt. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "There's talk of disputes over the estate. Do you know if she confided in you about any troubles?" Reverend Ambrose sighed. "She was burdened with many worries, especially since returning from Ceylon. There were tensions with the Lytton Smythe family, particularly regarding the management of property and finances." Do you think these tensions could have escalated to violence? The Reverend hesitated. In this village, we like to believe it can't. But people have long memories, and grudges run deep. Audra was not a woman, to be crossed lightly. Miss Marple glanced at the teacup in her hands, turning over a thought. I'm particularly interested in the sapphire ring. Did you notice anything unusual about it, or its importance to her? Ah, the ring, he said quietly. It was her most treasured possession. A gift from her late husband, they say, with a legend attached. A supposed curse that befalls anyone who tries to claim it unfairly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Superstition often cloaks truths better left unspoken. The Reverend nodded, eyes clouded with memory. There were whispers that the ring was more than just a jewel. It represented power within the family, a symbol of inheritance and perhaps betrayal. As they spoke, the distant toll of the village church clock marked the hour, reminding Miss Marple of the subtle passing of time, a constant in the midst of upheaval. Later that day, she returned to her cottage with a fresh resolve. The vicar's words had added a layer of complexity to the case, confirming that the sapphire ring was indeed a fulcrum around which much of the village's unrest revolved. But it was not merely greed, it was pride, history, and fear tangled together. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Clara Wren, the post office assistant, her cheeks flushed and eyes bright with urgency. Miss Marple, I thought you should know, Clara said breathlessly. There's been another incident at the village green. Someone found a torn piece of fabric caught on the iron fence. Miss Marple rose swiftly, her mind alert. Show me, Clara. They hurried to the village green, where a small crowd had gathered. The torn fabric was pale blue, its edges jagged and stained faintly, with what appeared to be mud. Miss Marple crouched, examining it closely. Does this match anything you've seen recently? She asked Clara. The young woman thought for a moment. It looks like part of a scarf Mrs. Copley was wearing the day of the fete. Mrs. Copley was the widow who had helped organize the garden party. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. I must speak with her immediately. The widow Copley lived in a neat cottage near the village square. When Miss Marple arrived, she found the woman sitting by the window, knitting nervously. Mrs. Copley, Miss Marple began gently, this piece of fabric was found on the fence at the village green. Do you recognize it? Mrs. Copley glanced down at the piece Miss Marple held out. Yes, that's part of my scarf. I must have lost it that day, but I didn't think much of it. Did you have any quarrels or disturbances at the fete? The widow's eyes widened. No quarrels, but there was an argument nearby. I heard raised voices near the tent where the raffle was held. Do you remember who was involved? She nodded slowly. It was Mr. Cartwright and Mrs. Lytton Smythe's nephew, Reginald. They were discussing the ring and the raffle in rather heated terms. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Reginald, you say? I have yet to meet him. Just arrived from London, Mrs. Copley explained. A rather slick young man, if I may say. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the torn fabric resting beside the sapphire ring on her table. The pieces of the puzzle were growing more numerous, and the portrait of the village's undercurrent of tension more detailed. Reginald's arrival introduced a new dimension. What claim did he have to the ring, and why would he confront Mr. Cartwright so vehemently? Her musings were interrupted by a knock and the entrance of Dr. David Fortescue, the village physician. He was a solid man in his 50s, with a kindly expression and eyes that missed nothing. Miss Marple, I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, doctor. Please sit. Dr. Fortescue settled into an armchair, the weight of responsibility evident in his posture. I thought you might be interested to know that I examined the body once more yesterday. Yes? And what did you discover? There's something curious. The cause of death was strangulation, but the marks on the neck suggest the use of a narrow cord, perhaps a ribbon. I find it odd that no such item was reported missing. Miss Marple's mind raced. A ribbon, a scarf. Could there be a connection? Was there any sign of a struggle? Minimal. It seems Mrs. Lytton Smythe knew her attacker. There was no need to fight off a stranger. Thank you, Doctor. This is most enlightening. As the doctor took his leave, Miss Marple's thoughts circled back to the village green, the torn fabric, and the heated argument. The threads began to entwine. A nephew, a businessman, a treasured ring, and now the silent witness of a torn scarf. Outside, the moon cast pale light over nether hedges, and Miss Marple, though quiet in her demeanor, felt the steady pulse of the mystery quicken. Somewhere amid the village's polite smiles and whispered suspicions, the truth waited, fragile and exposed. And Miss Marple intended to find it. The morning after her conversation with Dr. Fortescue, Miss Marple awoke with a sense of clarity that had eluded her in recent days. The image of that torn scarf, the mention of the narrow ribbon, the quarrel between Reginald and Mr. Cartwright. All these threads now demanded closer inspection. Yet, it was the subtle clues, the half-forgotten remarks and veiled expressions that Miss Marple had always found most telling. She resolved to revisit the scene of the fete and speak again with those who had been closest to the Lytton Smythe household in recent weeks. Her first call was to the village shop, where she found Mary Drew, the proprietor, arranging a fresh display of jams and preserves. Mary was a practical woman whose sharp eyes missed little and who had known the villagers for decades. "Good morning, Mary," Miss Marple greeted her. "I wonder if you might recall anything unusual about the day of the fete. Perhaps something you overheard or noticed in passing?" Mary paused, adjusting a jar on the shelf. "Well, Miss Marple, there was a fair bit of tension, you might say. Mrs. Lytton Smythe was quite particular about how everything should be arranged, but she wasn't her usual self. Nervous, perhaps. And there was Reginald, looking rather impatient, pacing about more than a man who just arrived from London should." "Did you see Mr. Cartwright at all that day?" "Not much, I'm afraid, but I did hear raised voices near the raffle tent. Something about the sapphire ring. Said it was a family heirloom, but some thought it might be worth a pretty penny." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Did anyone mention the whereabouts of the ring during the fete?" Mary looked thoughtful. "Audra kept it close, as far as I know. I believe it was locked in a small box she carried with her most of the time. But there was a moment, just before the raffle, when she spoke to her nephew privately. I didn't catch much, but they looked serious." Miss Marple's mind whirled with possibilities. The sapphire ring was more than a mere jewel. It was the heart of a family dispute, a symbol of trust and betrayal entwined. The fact that Reginald seemed so invested only deepened the mystery. Later that afternoon, she made her way to Greystone Manor, the grand old house that had once been the seat of the Lytton Smythe family. The manor's vast windows gleamed dully. In the overcast sky and its well-tended gardens were almost too immaculate, as if preserving the memory of a time before tragedy struck. She was greeted at the door by Mrs. Agnes Cartwright, who was evidently flustered yet cordial. "Miss Marple, do come in. I thought you might want to see the room where it all happened." Miss Marple followed her into the drawing room, where the furnishings seemed frozen in time. Velvet drapes, polished mahogany, and an ornate cabinet that evidently contained the infamous sapphire ring. "Mr. Cartwright has been most cooperative," Agnes said quietly. "But I can see how unsettling all this is for you." Miss Marple smiled gently. "It is the unraveling of human nature, Mrs. Cartwright, that always fascinates me. I wonder if you could tell me more about your husband's recent dealings with Reginald Lytton Smythe." Agnes hesitated, her hands clasped tightly. "There was tension between them. Reginald believes the ring should be his, as the rightful heir. Harold, my husband, insisted that the estate was more complicated than that. But Harold was a proud man. He wouldn't give in easily." "And the night of the fete?" Miss Marple pressed. Agnes's eyes darkened. Harold mentioned a meeting with Reginald, something about settling accounts and agreements, but he never told me what passed between them. Miss Marple noticed a flicker of unease beneath Agnes's composed exterior, but said nothing. She turned to examine the cabinet. The lock was intact, but the glass was slightly smudged, as if someone had pressed a hand against it in agitation. Miss Marple reached out and traced a faint mark near the latch, a delicate thread of blue, almost imperceptible. Her mind immediately returned to the torn fabric found at the village green. Was it possible that the scarf or the ribbon used to strangle Mrs. Lytton Smythe came from this very room? Agnes watched her closely. "You seem to have an idea, Miss Marple." "I am merely following the clues," she replied calmly. The following day, Miss Marple arranged to meet Reginald at the village inn. The young man arrived punctually, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed slightly out of place amid the rustic surroundings. His manner was confident, even charming, though there was an edge of impatience beneath his polished exterior. "Miss Marple, I presume?" he said with a measured smile. "I understand you have questions." She nodded. "Indeed, your arrival certainly stirred matters here. Could you tell me more about your claim to the sapphire ring?" Reginald's smile tightened. "It's family heritage. I have every right to it, and I intend to see that it is restored to me. Some have suggested your relationship with your uncle was strained." "That's an understatement," Reginald admitted. "He was determined to keep me at arm's length, but I'm not a man to be ignored." Miss Marple studied him closely. There was a restlessness in his eyes, a desire for control that seemed almost desperate. "And the argument with Mr. Cartwright?" "Business disagreements," Reginald said curtly. "Nothing more." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Do you own any scarves or ribbons of blue fabric?" He blinked, clearly caught off guard. "A few, yes. Why do you ask?" "Merely curious," she said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. As Reginald left, Miss Marple reflected on his demeanor. There was something rehearsed about his responses, as if he were guarding a secret that weighed heavily. Her next visit was to Mr. Theodore Cartwright himself. She found him at his office in the village, poring over ledgers with a furrowed brow. "Mr. Cartwright," she said softly, "I wanted to ask about your confrontation with Reginald." He looked up, his expression guarded. "That man has caused enough trouble. The ring isn't simply a piece of jewelry, it's a symbol of inheritance and power. I told Reginald to leave well enough alone. Did you notice anything unusual about Mrs. Lytton Smythe's behavior that day?" Cartwright paused, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "She was nervous, yes, but firm. She held the ring close, as if it were her last defense. And the scarf? Or any ribbons that might have gone missing?" Cartwright shook his head. "I didn't notice anything missing, but there was a scrap of blue fabric near the garden fence the next day. I assumed it was nothing." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The torn fabric was becoming more significant with each passing hour. That evening, as the village settled into twilight, Miss Marple sat quietly in her sitting room, the sapphire ring gleaming softly in the lamplight. Her thoughts were alive with possibilities, but one detail in particular gnawed at her: the presence of the blue fabric at two separate locations, the subtle mark on the cabinet lock, and the fact that no one had yet explained how it came to be torn and left behind. She realized that the answer might lie not in what was said openly, but in what had been concealed, small acts of carelessness or desperation that would reveal the true course of events. Her mind returned to Mrs. Copley's comment about the argument near the raffle tent and the detail of Mrs. Lytton Smythe's last private conversation with Reginald. The intertwining of pride, family secrets, and fear of loss all pointed toward a carefully orchestrated deception. The village of Nether Hedges, with its quaint cottages and calm facades, was not immune to the darker currents beneath, and Miss Marple, ever patient and watchful, was poised to follow those currents wherever they might lead. That evening, The village was cloaked in a mist that softened the sharp edges of Netherhedge's winding lanes and muted the chatter of evening gatherings. Miss Marple, seated by her window with a warm cup of tea, allowed her mind to wander through the day's revelations. The subtle hint of blue fabric, the unsettled attitudes of Reginald and Cartwright, and the veiled anxieties of Agnes Cartwright, all these pieces seemed to hover just out of reach, like shadows on the edge of a candle's glow. The truth was there, Miss Marple was sure, but it was concealed beneath layers of pride, fear, and carefully crafted appearances. The following morning, she made her way to the village church, where the vicar, Reverend Harold Penrose, was known to have a keen eye for the community's undercurrents. The old man greeted her warmly, though his eyes betrayed a weariness that came from shouldering more than just spiritual duties. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe this visit?" he asked, as she took a seat in the pew near the altar. "I was hoping, Reverend, that you might share any observations you have about the recent events. You see, the village is a small stage, and sometimes the smallest gestures speak volumes." Reverend Penrose nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed. I saw Mrs. Lytton Smythe only a few days before the fete. She seemed distracted, even distant, as if burdened by a secret she dared not voice. Her eyes would wander past the stained glass as though searching for something beyond these walls." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "Did she mention anything about her family, or about the sapphire ring?" The vicar hesitated. "She did confide, in a manner of speaking, that certain things must remain buried. Old wounds do not always heal, Miss Marple, but sometimes fester beneath polite smiles." "That is very true," Miss Marple agreed softly. As their conversation continued, the vicar recounted an incident from the previous week. During a charity luncheon, he had overheard a hushed argument in the churchyard between Reginald and a local woman named Clara Finch, a governess recently employed by the Cartwright household. Their voices were low but sharp, betraying a mixture of frustration and fear. Intrigued, Miss Marple sought out Clara Finch the very next day. The young woman was modest, with nervous eyes and a voice that trembled slightly when she spoke of the events. "Mr. Reginald was difficult," she confided. "He was demanding, especially about the ring. He insisted I keep watch during the fete, but I was confused why." "Keep watch? For whom?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "For the ring, I think. He didn't trust anyone else. Said it was worth more than all of Netherhedge's put together." Clara hesitated, then added, "There was talk that Mrs. Lytton Smythe was planning to give the ring away. To someone. That's why Reginald was so desperate." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. The idea of the ring being gifted was unexpected. She wondered who might be the intended recipient, and what that might mean for the tangled relationships in the village. Later that afternoon, she revisited Greystone Manor, hoping to find Agnes Cartwright alone. Instead, she found her in the garden, pacing beneath the ancient oak tree with an air of restless agitation. Agnes glanced up as Miss Marple approached, her face pale yet resolute. "I've been thinking," Agnes said without preamble. "There's something I must confess. Harold and we were not as distant from Reginald as you might believe." Miss Marple regarded her steadily. "Go on." Harold hoped to resolve matters peacefully, but there was more at stake than just the ring. The estate itself holds secrets, debts accrued long ago. If Reginald took control, it would unravel everything we've tried to protect. "And Mrs. Lytton Smythe?" Miss Marple inquired softly. Agnes's hands trembled. She was caught in the middle, fearful, proud, and desperate. There was talk of a compromise, but some in the family opposed it fiercely. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "And this compromise, was it ever made explicit?" Agnes shook her head. "No, only hinted at. But there was a letter, I believe, hidden away. The revelation was a delicate thread that might unravel the entire tapestry." Miss Marple's curiosity was piqued. A hidden letter, a secret compromise. These were the kinds of subtle clues she knew would illuminate the darkest corners of the mystery. Her next step was clear. She needed to find this letter. That evening, she returned to the Lytton Smythe estate, this time with permission from Agnes to search the family archives in the study. The room was lined with shelves heavy with leather-bound volumes and faded photographs. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the spines, listening to the silence that only secrets knew how to keep. In the drawer of the large oak desk, she found a worn leather pouch. Inside was a letter, the handwriting delicate but firm. It was from Mrs. Lytton Smythe, addressed to her husband, expressing fears about the ring's future and hinting at a meeting with Reginald that could alter everything. Miss Marple read the lines carefully. "I fear the ring will bring ruin rather than peace. We must tread carefully, for old debts and resentments run deep." The letter spoke of trust and betrayal, of hopes dashed and alliances forged in shadows. It was a quiet testament to the fragility of family bonds. As she pondered the letter's meaning, a soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Agnes stood hesitantly in the doorway. "I was right to trust you," she said quietly. "There's more than pride at stake here. The village itself holds memories some would prefer to forget." Miss Marple closed the letter gently. And it is often the forgotten memories that tell the truest tales. The days that followed saw an intensification of the village's whispered conversations and sidelong glances. The police, eager to pin the crime on Reginald, found their evidence increasingly tenuous in the face of new questions. Miss Marple, meanwhile, focused on the small details. The thread of blue fabric now accounted for as part of a broken ribbon. Reginald had confessed to carrying, the hidden letter casting light on motives previously obscured, and the subtle fractures within the Cartwright family. One evening, she was visited by Clara Finch once more, her demeanor more composed. "I remembered." "Something?" Clara said, wringing her hands nervously. "On the night of the fete, I saw a figure near the garden shed. It was too dark to see clearly, but they were holding something small and glinting." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Did you hear anything? Footsteps? Voices?" Clara nodded. A whispered argument. Something about getting what is owed and no turning back. The pieces were assembling, each whisper and glance revealing the undercurrents beneath Nether Hedge's tranquil surface. Miss Marple felt the final act approaching, a carefully choreographed confrontation that would draw out the truth hidden behind layers of civility and deceit. She was ready to play her part, subtle and watchful as ever, knowing that the greatest revelations often came not from loud accusations, but from the quiet unraveling of human nature. And in that, Miss Marple's gentle, unyielding eye was unmatched. That night, as the village of Nether Hedges settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resting forgotten in her lap. The soft crackle of the flames seemed to echo the turmoil stirring within the village, secrets long buried, resentment simmering beneath polite smiles, and the ever-tightening knot of the sapphire ring's curse. She thought of Clara Finch's words, the figure in the garden shed, the glint of something small and shining, the whispered threats exchanged under cover of darkness, the suggestion of an argument, of debts and irreversible choices, offered a new path, a delicate thread, to follow. Yet it was the psychological undercurrents, the subtle gestures and carefully veiled emotions that truly captured Miss Marple's attention. Early the next morning, she arranged a quiet meeting with the key players, under the pretext of discussing the estate's future. It was the kind of gathering that, in a small village, always carried the weight of social observation as well as practical matters. The drawing room at Greystone Manor filled with the familiar faces. Reginald, his demeanor brittle but controlled, Agnes, pale yet composed, Harold Cartwright, resolute, and to Miss Marple's surprise, Clara Finch, who had been invited by Agnes at the last moment. As the conversation turned from mundane topics to the unresolved tensions around the sapphire ring, Miss Marple watched closely, attuned to the slightest shifts in expression and tone. Reginald was the first to speak, his voice carefully measured. "I see no reason to prolong this charade. The ring is mine by right, and any who oppose me are only standing in the way of progress." Agnes's eyes flashed with restrained fury. "Progress built on greed is no progress at all, Reginald. This estate has a history, responsibilities, not just to us but to the village and its people." Harold nodded solemnly. "We must not forget the debts owed to those who came before us, nor the promises made in good faith." Clara remained silent, her gaze flickering between the elder Cartwrights and Reginald. When Miss Marple gently asked her to share what she knew of the night, of the fête, Clara's voice barely rose above a whisper. "There was a disagreement," she admitted. "Not just between Reginald and Mrs. Lytton Smythe, but others as well. Old alliances were questioned. I overheard talk of betrayal, and that the ring might be the key to restoring or destroying all of it." Miss Marple's eyes rested on Reginald, noting how his jaw tightened imperceptibly. Yet it was Agnes's reaction that spoke volumes, her hands clenched tightly, her composure momentarily shaken. As the discussion deepened, Miss Marple subtly guided the conversation toward the mysterious letter she had discovered. Agnes hesitated, then confirmed that it had been written days before the fête, filled with worry and a plea for caution. The atmosphere grew tense, the polite facade cracking to reveal the complicated web of emotions beneath. Fear, resentment, desperation, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the sapphire ring symbolized far more than mere wealth. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a solitary walk through the village, letting the cool air clear her mind. She paused outside the churchyard, where the old yew trees cast long shadows over the weathered gravestones. The past, like those stones, was immutable, yet filled with stories waiting to be uncovered. Her thoughts turned to the whispered argument Clara had described and the figure near the garden shed. The glinting object, the threat of getting what is owed, suggested a plan more deliberate than a crime of passion. Miss Marple's gaze settled on the nearby woods that bordered the Cartwright estate. It was there, she suspected, that a critical piece of evidence might be concealed, something the murderer hoped would remain hidden forever. That evening, under the cloak of darkness, Miss Marple visited the garden shed. The door creaked softly as she pushed it open, revealing the faint scent of damp earth and old wood. On the floor lay a discarded scrap of fabric, a bit of dark blue cloth, its edges frayed. Miss Marple's fingers brushed over it thoughtfully. She stepped outside. The rustle of leaves alerted her to movement. From the shadows emerged Harold Cartwright, his expression grim but not surprised. "You shouldn't be here alone, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "And yet here I am, Harold," she replied with a gentle smile. "Sometimes the answers lie where we least expect them." Harold nodded slowly. "There are truths better left unspoken, but perhaps the time for silence is ending." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "If you have something to confess, I'm always willing to listen." Harold hesitated, then began to speak of the burdens he carried, the debts hidden in ledgers, the family fractures, and the desperation that had driven him to make choices he now regretted. He confessed to a confrontation with Reginald on the night of the fête, a heated exchange over the future of the estate and the ring. "I never wished harm to anyone," Harold insisted, "but the fear that everything we hold dear might be lost. It clouds the mind." Miss Marple listened, her mind piecing together the fragments of motive and opportunity. The web was tightening, yet the final strand remained elusive. As Harold left, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Clara Finch and Agnes Cartwright. The puzzle was nearly complete, but one question lingered. Who, among them, had taken the step from anger to action? The following day, the village awoke to startling news. The local constable had found a second crime scene, an attempt on Clara Finch's life, barely thwarted. She was shaken but alive, her account revealing a desperate attempt to silence her. Before she could reveal more, the villagers whispered anew, suspicion rippling through their ranks like a sudden storm. Miss Marple, however, remained composed. The attack on Clara was no random act, but a calculated move by someone desperate to keep their secrets buried. The sapphire ring was not only a symbol, but a weapon, capable of bringing ruin to anyone who dared cross its path. Gathering her thoughts, Miss Marple resolved to confront the heart of the mystery. The game was nearing its end, and the subtle psychological dance she had so carefully orchestrated was about to yield its final, revealing step. In the quiet calm before the storm, Miss Marple's keen eyes and steady mind prepared to draw out the truth, one carefully chosen word at a time. The day dawned with a chill that seemed to seep into every corner of Nether Hedges, as if the village itself were bracing for the revelations that Miss Marple had quietly set in motion. The attempt on Clara Finch's life had rattled the community to its core, stirring a mixture of fear and restless speculation. Yet beneath the clamor of gossip, there was an undercurrent of change, an unspoken acknowledgement that the carefully guarded facade of civility was crumbling. Miss Marple arrived at Greystone Manor shortly after breakfast, greeted by the uneasy glances of Agnes and Reginald Cartwright. The weight of recent events hung heavy between them. Agnes's usually composed demeanor was tinged with a nervous edge, while Reginald's sharp eyes betrayed a growing impatience. "It seems," Miss Marple began gently, "that the sapphire ring's shadow has grown too long to ignore. But secrets, as you well know, rarely stay buried forever." Agnes gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Indeed, Miss Marple, the village is not what it seems, and neither are we." Reginald's voice cut through the quiet, sharp as a blade. "We should bring this to a close. The police have their suspects, and it is time for them to act." Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "The police often look for what is easiest to see, Reginald, but the truth tends to hide in plain sight. Sometimes it is the small things, overheard words, a glance, a hesitation, that reveal the heart of a mystery." With that, she turned her attention to Clara Finch, who sat quietly in the corner, still recovering from the ordeal. Miss Marple had insisted Clara join them. Her testimony was crucial, yet delicate. The young woman's eyes, bright with a mix of fear and resolve, met Miss Marple's with a silent plea for understanding. "Clara," Miss Marple said softly, "you have been very brave. Please tell us exactly what happened that night." Clara's voice was steady, but low. "I was walking home after the fete when I heard voices near the garden shed. I thought it was Mr. Cartwright and Mr. Reginald arguing, but then someone else appeared, a figure I could not clearly see. They grabbed me from behind and tried to silence me." She paused, swallowing hard. "They were desperate. I think they feared I knew too much about the ring, and about what had happened to Mrs. Lytton Smythe." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did you recognize this person at all? Even a shadow, a voice?" Clara shook her head. "No, they wore gloves, and the cloak hid their face." A tense silence settled. Agnes was the first to speak. "If the attacker is so careful, it means the stakes are higher than any of us imagined." Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, noting the subtle shifts in posture and expression. Each individual bore the strain of suspicion differently. Reginald's irritation was barely contained, Agnes's worry veiled by determination, and Clara's trauma softened by a steely resolve. The detective's thoughts returned to the letter, the hidden plea for caution, and the subtle fabric scrap she had found in the garden shed. There was a connection, a thread weaving through the village's surface that only patience and careful observation could unravel. Later, Miss Marple sought out Harold Cartwright. His admission of confrontation with Reginald lingered heavily in her mind. She found him in the village pub, seated alone in a quiet corner, nursing a cup of tea. "Harold," she said kindly, taking the seat opposite him, "it seems these troubles run deeper than a simple family quarrel. I wonder, did you notice anything unusual in the days before the fete? Anything out of place? Any odd behavior from those around you?" Harold sighed, a weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken guilt. There was tension, more than usual. "I overheard Reginald speaking with Clara Finch just before the fete about the ring. Something about securing his future, no matter the cost." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her teacup. "And Clara did mention overhearing something similar. Do you think Reginald might be more desperate than he lets on?" Harold nodded slowly. "Desperate enough to do something reckless, perhaps. But I would never have thought him capable of violence." "Desperation makes strange bedfellows," Miss Marple murmured. As she left the pub, her mind circled the possibilities. Reginald was a man accustomed to control, to getting his way. If the ring was truly his ambition's keystone, then anyone standing in his path was a threat. That evening, Miss Marple arranged another gathering, this time in the village hall, under the guise of a community meeting to discuss the estate's future. It was a clever ruse, designed to observe interactions, to notice who might reveal too much under the casual guise of civility. As villagers filed in, whispering among themselves, the atmosphere was taut. Eyes flickered with suspicion, hands fidgeted, with nervous energy. Miss Marple's presence was a quiet anchor amidst the storm. She spoke briefly of the estate's heritage and the importance of unity, but allowed the conversation to drift naturally toward recent events. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tensions rose. An elderly villager, Mrs. Pennington, raised her voice. "I never trusted that ring, always thought it carried a curse. Old Mr. Lytton Smythe warned us of greed's price." A younger man, Tom Hargreaves, retorted sharply. "Superstition won't save us from the truth. We need answers, not ghost stories." Miss Marple watched as Reginald's jaw clenched, his usual mask faltering. Agnes moved closer to Clara, protective and resolute. When the discussion lulled, Miss Marple quietly suggested a break. As people mingled, she pulled Reginald aside. "You seem quite agitated, Reginald. Is there something you wish to confess? A burden too heavy to bear alone?" Reginald's eyes hardened. "I will not be bullied into admitting to what I did not do." "But sometimes, admitting the truth frees us from our darkest fears," Miss Marple replied gently. Before he could respond, Clara approached, her voice firm. "I want to speak, Reginald. There is more at stake here than pride." The room hushed as Clara began to recount a fragment of a conversation overheard, one that suggested Reginald's hand in a plan far more sinister than mere inheritance disputes. Her words were measured, leaving just enough ambiguity to unsettle. Without accusing outright, Reginald's composure shattered. "Enough! This charade ends now." Chaos erupted, voices rising, accusations flying like sparks. Miss Marple, however, remained calm, her eyes reflecting the glint of the sapphire ring she now held delicately in her hand, the ring that had stirred so much darkness beneath Netherhedge's peaceful surface. With the crowd's attention, she raised her voice gently but firmly. "Let us remember that truth is a patient thing. It reveals itself not in rage or fear, but in quiet understanding." The villagers slowly quieted, drawn into the calm strength of her presence. Miss Marple knew the moment had come to weave together the tangled threads, the hidden motives, the desperate acts, and the carefully concealed clues were all pieces of a puzzle now within reach. The final act was near, where the past's shadows would be drawn into the light, and the true nature of the curse would be laid bare. The sapphire ring, so long a symbol of power and peril, was about to relinquish its secrets, and when it did, none in Netherhedges would forget the lessons of greed, trust, and the fragile nature of human hearts. The room fell into a hush that was almost reverent, the kind of silence that weighs heavy with anticipation and the faintest tremor of fear. Miss Marple held the sapphire ring delicately between her fingers, its deep blue gleam catching the wan light from the window, reflecting shards of a long, tangled history. She looked around the faces gathered, some filled with anger, others with confusion, and many with that unmistakable flicker of apprehension. "Before we proceed," Miss Marple began, her voice steady and gentle, "there is something I must ask each of you to consider carefully. What does this ring truly represent? To some, a symbol of legacy, to others, a talisman of power. But to all, it is a reminder of choices made and consequences borne." She set the ring on the polished oak table in front of her, the sapphire now seeming almost to pulse with an inner life. The villagers leaned in, drawn by the quiet gravity of the moment. Miss Marple took a breath and then began. "The events that have unfolded here are not the result of a sudden fury or unpremeditated passion. They stem from a calculated weaving of deceit and desperation, played out beneath our very eyes." Her gaze settled on Reginald Cartwright, whose face had drained of color. "You, Reginald, sought to claim what you believed was rightfully yours. But in doing so, you underestimated the bonds that tie this community, and the watchful eyes that see beyond the surface." Reginald's voice was barely a whisper. "I wanted to protect my future. The estate, the ring. They are all that remain of my family's name. Yet in protecting yourself, you cast a shadow over the lives of others," Miss Marple said quietly, "including the dear Mrs. Lytton Smythe, whose death was no accident, and Clara Finch, who narrowly escaped a similar fate." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. The letter Clara found, the fabric in the garden shed, the whispered threats, and the sudden confrontation with Harold Cartwright, all these pieces fit into a pattern that reveals the truth. Turning now to the room, Miss Marple's eyes met those of Agnes, Clara, Harold, and the others. The ring was never merely an heirloom. It was a symbol of control, wielded by Mrs. Lytton Smythe to maintain power over the village's hidden debts and secrets. Reginald's desperation to claim it led him to orchestrate the attempt on Clara, hoping to silence a witness. But the true tragedy lies deeper. She lifted her hand slightly, motioning toward the gathering. The true murderer is not the one who acted in haste, but the one who planned with cold calculation. It is someone who understood the weight of the ring's legacy and the ruin it could bring to those who oppose them. A murmur spread through the crowd. Miss Marple held up a finger to command silence, then continued. "The fabric found at the scene. Its unique pattern matches a garment, worn only by one person here, someone who had access to the garden shed and opportunity when the lights went out." All eyes turned toward Harold Cartwright, who swallowed nervously but met her gaze squarely. "I don't understand," he said. "I'm no murderer." "No," Miss Marple replied softly. "You are not. But you did confront Reginald that night, and your anger may have been a mask for fear. Fear of what the ring's curse might do to your family." She then glanced at Agnes, who shifted uncomfortably. "Agnes, your protectiveness of Reginald is admirable, but your secrecy has made you complicit in hiding the truth. Your efforts to shield your brother have only prolonged the pain." Agnes's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Miss Marple's next words cut through the room like a knife. "The final piece of the puzzle is the missing letter, the one Mrs. Lytton Smythe wrote but never sent. It was addressed to Clara Finch, a warning and a confession, revealing that the curse of the sapphire ring was not supernatural, but born from human greed and betrayal." Clara's eyes widened, tears spilling down her cheeks. "She meant to protect me, to expose the real danger. And now we must finish what she started," Miss Marple said, her voice firm but kind, "by acknowledging the truth and bringing justice." At that moment, a sudden movement from the back of the room drew everyone's attention. It was Reginald, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "You don't understand. I didn't kill her. It was Agnes. She couldn't bear the shame. She was afraid the scandal would ruin us all." Agnes gasped, shaking her head vehemently. "No, Reginald, stop. You're twisting things. It was you who planned this. You who set everything in motion." The tension exploded. Miss Marple stepped, calmly between them, raising her hand for silence. "This accusation will not resolve the matter," she said. "But your conflict has revealed something crucial. Both of you feared exposure, both of you had motives, and both of you were capable of deceit. Yet only one could commit murder." She turned her eyes slowly to the assembled villagers. "The truth, dear friends, is that the curse of the Sapphire ring is a curse born not of jewels or legends, but of human nature itself. It thrives on envy, fear, and the desperate need to protect one's own at any cost." Her voice softened. "The murderer is someone who acted in cold calculation, who understood that by removing Mrs. Lytton Smythe, they could seize control. Someone whose outward calm masked a turbulent and dangerous heart." Then, with a deliberate calmness, she said, "I believe the murderer is Agnes Cartwright." A gasp rippled through the room. Agnes's face went pale, but she held Miss Marple's gaze with a strange mixture of resignation and defiance. Miss Marple continued, "Your protective instincts led you to cross a line. You believed that by silencing Mrs. Lytton Smythe, you could safeguard your family's name and future. The fabric found at the scene belongs to a coat you wore that night. Your fingerprints were on the garden shed latch. The attempt on Clara Finch was a desperate act to prevent exposure." Agnes's voice was barely audible. "It's true. I didn't mean to kill her. It was meant to scare her, to make her stop meddling." Miss Marple nodded, a faint sadness in her eyes. But once the deed was done, there was no turning back. And so the curse claimed another victim, not a supernatural force, but the dark side of human frailty. The police stepped forward, taking Agnes gently but firmly into custody. The villagers watched in stunned silence as the truth settled like a shroud over nether hedges. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple lingered for a moment by the oak table, the sapphire ring gleaming quietly in the fading light. Clara approached, her expression one of tentative hope. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for seeing what no one else could." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Sometimes, dear, the greatest mysteries are not in the jewels we covet, but in the hearts of those who possess them. The village, though scarred, would find its way back to peace. But the lessons of greed, betrayal, and the fragile bonds of trust would remain. A reminder that beneath the surface of quiet life, shadows always linger." And in the stillness of the evening, Miss Marple, ever watchful and wise, reflected quietly on the curious, complex nature of human beings and the truths that only patience and kindness can uncover. The days that followed Agnes Cartwright's arrest cast a quiet but undeniable shadow over nether hedges. The village, once a tapestry of cheerful chatter and familiar faces, now seemed subdued, as if holding its breath against the weight of what had transpired. Yet, life did not stop. The daily rhythms, church bells, market visits, and evening firesides persisted with a gentle insistence, as if to remind everyone that time, no matter how dark the moment, moves steadily forward. Miss Marple, though seldom one for overt involvement beyond her observations, found herself drawn into the village's quiet revival. There was much to be said in the moments between the obvious, the silences where people's true feelings surfaced, where subtle glances betrayed more than spoken words ever could. Clara Finch, still fragile but determined, had taken it upon herself to organize a small gathering at the vicarage, a gesture of communal healing and solidarity. Miss Marple had accepted the invitation, sensing it would offer insight into how the village was coping, and perhaps what was yet unresolved beneath the surface. As she stepped into the vicarage garden that afternoon, The air was fragrant with the first blooms of early summer. The village's folk had come together in small clusters, voices low, smiles tentative. Miss Marple's keen eyes noted who avoided whom, who sought solace in quiet corners, and who wore the mask of unaffected cheerfulness. The vicar himself, a kindly man with gentle eyes, greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple, your presence is a comfort to us all." "Thank you, Reverend," she replied with a soft smile. "These times call for more than just comfort. They call for understanding." The conversation soon turned to Agnes and the startling revelations. Many expressed sorrow, others disbelief, yet there was a thread running through the discourse, a question unspoken but palpable. Was the mystery truly solved? Had all the shadows been chased away, or did some still lurk in the folds of this quiet village? Miss Marple listened attentively, as Mrs. Pritchard, the village baker, whispered to a small group, "I've known Agnes since she was a child, but this darkness surprised me. What makes a person cross such a terrible line?" Miss Marple's thoughts echoed the sentiment. Human nature was, indeed, a labyrinth, sometimes shaped by desperation, sometimes by pride or fear. Yet, she sensed that Agnes's confession, while genuine, might not encompass the entire truth. Later that evening, as the village settled into its usual calm, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on one detail that had seemed insignificant, but now weighed on her mind. The note Clara had received from Mrs. Lytton Smythe, the one never sent, and the peculiar choice of words within it. The message hinted at a deeper undercurrent of threats, manipulation, and a power struggle that transcended mere family quarrels. Miss Marple decided to visit Clara again, hoping to explore the note more thoroughly. At Clara's modest cottage, warmed by the glow of a crackling fire, they pored over the faded handwriting. The letter spoke cryptically of a hidden hand guiding events, a web spun long ago, and a warning not to trust those closest. Clara sighed. "I never understood what she meant until now. But if Agnes truly acted alone, why would Mrs. Lytton Smythe speak so cautiously? It feels as though there was someone else involved, someone who pulled the strings behind the scenes." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It would seem, dear Clara, that this is a story with more than one author. And while Agnes confessed to her actions, we must ask ourselves who stood to gain beyond the obvious." The next morning, Miss Marple made her way to Netherhedge's Manor, now closed off to the public but still a place full of echoes. She requested to speak privately with Harold Cartwright, the eldest son, whose demeanor had been notably reserved since the events unfolded. Harold met her in the grand but somber drawing room. His eyes betrayed a weariness that words could not fully express. "I know my family has been through much," he began, "and I regret all that has happened. But I assure you, I had no part in any wrongdoing." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Your candor is appreciated, Harold. Yet there are pieces that do not fit neatly. Your confrontation with Reginald on the night of the murder, your sudden change of plans afterward, it all merits careful thought." Harold sighed, rubbing his temples. "Reginald and I were at odds, yes, but I would never harm Mrs. Lytton Smythe. She was difficult, but family." "Sometimes family ties are the most tangled," Miss Marple mused. "May I ask about your business affairs? The letter mentioned debts and threats. Could these have brought additional pressures upon your household?" Harold hesitated. "There are debts, yes, and the estate has been struggling. But we were managing, or so I thought." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Sometimes the management we believe we have is only an illusion. Have you noticed anything unusual? Letters, visitors, or conversations that might hint at hidden influences?" Harold looked away, then back. "There was a man, Mr. Collins, a solicitor. He's been rather persistent lately. I thought his visits were routine, but routine or not, Miss Marple said softly. Sometimes the most ordinary visits carry extraordinary weight. The name Mr. Collins had surfaced briefly in earlier conversations, but now it seemed to carry new significance. Miss Marple's mind began weaving threads together: the solicitor's interest, the subtle shifts in family dynamics, the unsent letters' veiled warnings. Determined to uncover more, Miss Marple arranged to meet this Mr. Collins under the pretense of a casual inquiry. When the solicitor arrived at the village tea room, his polished manner and practiced ease did little to conceal a sharp, calculating mind. Miss Marple's gentle questions soon led him to reveal concerns over the estate's finances, threats from creditors, and a mysterious benefactor whose identity he guarded carefully. His evasiveness, subtle though it was, spoke volumes. Returning home that evening, Miss Marple felt the threads of this puzzle tightening. The sapphire ring was indeed a symbol of power, but that power extended far beyond what the villagers had yet realized. There was an unseen hand still at work, manipulating events from the shadows. As night deepened over nether hedges, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The moonlight cast soft patterns across the room, but her mind was sharp and alert, piecing together a tapestry of motives, deceptions, and hidden alliances. The curse of the sapphire ring was not yet fully broken, and Miss Marple knew the path ahead would require every ounce of her subtle skill and profound understanding of human nature to reveal the final, elusive truth. The following morning dawned with an unusual chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of nether hedges. The village, still wrapped in the quiet unease of recent revelations, began its day under a pale, gray sky that promised rain. Miss Marple, ever observant, took note of how the weather seemed to mirror the unsettled mood lingering among the villagers. After a brief breakfast, she decided to revisit the solicitor, Mr. Collins, with a new line of inquiry. His evasiveness during their last meeting had stirred her curiosity, and she suspected he knew more than he let on. The tea room, usually a hub of gentle gossip and light laughter, was notably subdued as she arrived. Mr. Collins was already seated at a corner table, nursing a cup of tea, his posture impeccably composed. "Good morning, Mr. Collins," Miss Marple began with her customary warmth. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by again. There are just a few more questions I find difficult to set aside." He glanced up, his practiced smile in place, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course, Miss Marple, I am at your disposal." Miss Marple settled herself and, with the softness of a friend rather than an investigator, continued. "You mentioned a mysterious benefactor, someone whose identity you are careful to protect. It's quite intriguing, don't you think? A benefactor who might be tied to the recent troubles in the Cartwright family." Mr. Collins shifted slightly, a flicker of tension crossing his features before he masked it. "I'm afraid I must maintain client confidentiality. There are delicate matters at stake." "I quite understand," Miss Marple said gently. "But perhaps you could tell me if this benefactor is someone close to the family, or a stranger with interests that reach beyond the estate." He hesitated, then sighed softly, as if conceding a small piece of the puzzle. "The benefactor is indeed connected to the family, though not by blood. Someone who has been deeply invested in the welfare of Nether Hedges and the Cartwright legacy, though with certain expectations, shall we say." Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving these new strands with the fragments already gathered. "Expectations that, if unmet, might lead to unfortunate consequences?" "That would be a fair assessment," Mr. Collins replied, eyes steady. "It is a complicated web." "Complications often lead to desperation," Miss Marple murmured. "And desperation, in a tight-knit community such as this, can make people act in ways they never imagined." Before Mr. Collins could answer, the door to the tea room opened, and Clara Finch stepped inside, her face pale but resolute. She spotted Miss Marple and approached with a tentative smile. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said softly. "Not at all, my dear. Please join us." Miss Marple replied warmly. Clara settled beside her, casting a quick glance at Mr. Collins, who regarded her with polite reserve. "I wanted to speak with you, Miss Marple," Clara began, voice steady despite the turmoil she had endured, "about the night of the murder, and about some things I've remembered." Miss Marple's eyes lit with quiet interest. "Please go on." Clara took a deep breath. "There was a sound I didn't notice at first. The faintest scrape, like a drawer being opened or something slid across a surface. I thought nothing of it then, but now I wonder if it was connected to the ring, or to whoever was moving about the house late that evening." "That is quite important," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Often it is those small, overlooked sounds that tell the true story." Clara nodded, then hesitated. "And there's something else. The night before, I found a folded note tucked behind a loose brick in the fireplace. A note written in a hurried hand. It spoke of fear and warnings, and it mentioned the name Edmund." "Edmund?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "The eldest son of the Lytton-Smythe family." "Yes," Clara confirmed. "I had not thought much of it at the time, but now it seems the message was a cry for help, possibly from someone who feared for their life." Mr. Collins's face tightened imperceptibly, and Miss Marple made a mental note of his reaction. "This Edmund," she said, "does he still live in the village?" "Only in the town nearby," Clara answered. "But he was here often enough to be involved in family affairs." Miss Marple's mind flickered over the connections. The curse, the sapphire ring, the fractured family dynamics, and now this cryptic warning. Each piece seemed to draw her closer to a truth more tangled than anyone suspected. Later that afternoon, with Clara's permission, Miss Marple ventured to the Lytton-Smythe estate, a grand but somewhat faded manor on the edge of the village, where whispers of old secrets seemed to linger in the heavy curtains and worn carpets. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hargreaves, a woman with a sharp eye and a guarded manner, answered the door. Miss Marple explained her visit delicately, and after some persuasion, Mrs. Hargreaves allowed her to see the study where Edmund had spent many hours. The room was lined with shelves heavy with leather-bound volumes and a desk cluttered with papers and letters. Miss Marple's gaze settled on a small, unlocked drawer, a curious detail. She opened it to find several folded notes, including one that matched the handwriting on the letter Clara had discovered. As she examined the note, a shadow fell across the room, and Edmund Lytton-Smythe himself stepped inside, a man in his late 40s with sharp features and a guarded expression. "I hear you've been looking into family matters," he said quietly, eyes steady on Miss Marple. "Some things are better left alone." Miss Marple met his gaze with calm resolve. "On the contrary, Mr. Lytton-Smythe, it is precisely because of what's been left alone that we find ourselves in such troubling times." Edmund's jaw tightened. "My family has its faults, but no one outside should pry. Sometimes it is the inside knowledge that helps prevent further harm," Miss Marple replied gently. "I hope you will understand that I seek only the truth." Edmund studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, but beware. Truth can be a dangerous thing in this village." As Miss Marple left the manor, the afternoon sun breaking, through scattered clouds, she felt the invisible threads tightening once more. The curse of the sapphire ring was no longer just a story of superstition. It was a reality shaped by ambition, betrayal, and fear. And in the heart of it all lay a secret waiting to be uncovered, one that would reveal not only the truth of the murder, but also the fragile nature of trust among those who wore the mask of civility. Miss Marple knew the next steps had to be taken with care. The final act was drawing near, and with it the unmasking of the true hand behind the curse, and the crime that had shaken Netherhedges to its core.